Good evening, listeners. This is your station, broadcasting live, or perhaps it's safer to say, broadcasting in the midst of something no one could have anticipated. You're listening to the radio during the escalation of a global trade war, one that has spiraled into an economic catastrophe. Unlike anything we've seen before, the markets are in freefall. Nations once considered stable and unshakable are crumbling under the weight of tariffs, embargoes, and retaliatory strikes. Factories that once buzzed with the constant hum of productivity now sit silent, their lights dimmed, their doors locked tight. Global trade, once the lifeblood of the world's economies, is now a distant echo, replaced by a churning, suffocating silence. If you're listening to this, chances are you already know something is wrong. You may have seen the first signs of panic in the stores, where shelves are emptying faster than you can restock them. Perhaps you've heard the whispers of layoffs as businesses tighten their belts, cutting costs to stay afloat. And those lucky enough to still have jobs, well, they're uncertain about tomorrow. You may not feel it yet, but make no mistake. The world as we knew it is shifting beneath our feet, and for many, the ground has already given way. In major cities across the globe, protests have erupted, angry crowds demanding answers, calling for retribution. Governments are scrambling to secure borders, as nations, once allies, now turn against each other. The market crash, a precursor to the unrelenting wave of chaos, has obliterated millions of jobs, leaving entire families stranded in an economic abyss. Some say the worst is yet to come. Today, we find ourselves standing at the precipice, watching as the very fabric of society begins to unravel. It's not just the rich and the powerful who are feeling the sting of this trade war. No, it's every single person, every family, every community. The small businesses that once kept neighborhoods thriving are shuttering one by one. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for our future? As I speak to you right now, I know there are those among you who may be scared. You might be worried about your job, about the roof over your head, about your loved ones, and you have every right to feel that way. Because in moments like this, uncertainty becomes a cruel companion. But let me tell you something. The story we're living through, this story of chaos, of fear, is not one of finality. There is still hope. There is still the possibility of tomorrow. And I promise you this, as long as there are voices willing to speak, there will be a chance to rebuild, to restore. The road ahead will be difficult, but not impossible. If you're listening to this broadcast tonight, you're not alone. We may be on the edge of something that seems unfathomable, but in the shadows, in the silence, there are stories of hope, of communities banding together, of families refusing to give up, of individuals who rise to meet the challenge, no matter how insurmountable it may seem. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey not just through the events that have led us here, but through the lives of those who are living in this reality. Through their letters, their voices, and their stories, we'll learn what it means to hold on, what it means to survive, to adapt, and yes, to hope. As we begin this journey together, I want you to keep one thing in mind. You're listening to this broadcast because right now you are part of something bigger. You're part of a story that we'll tell, that we'll share, and that will survive. This is not the end. Remember, this is only the beginning. The impact of the global trade war isn't just felt by nations or corporations. It reverberates in the lives of ordinary people whose stories paint a deeply human picture of struggle, loss, and resilience. Let me introduce you to a few voices from the ground, individuals whose lives have been upended by the forces shaping this crisis. First, there's Elena, a small business owner from a bustling city in Eastern Europe. Her cafe was once the heartbeat of her community, an intimate place where neighbors gathered, shared stories, and found comfort in one another's company. But now, Elena's cafe stands empty. The tariffs on her imported goods, the rising cost of ingredients, and the collapse of local trade have left her unable to keep the doors open. In a letter she sent to her sister, Elena writes, "Dear Irina, I don't know how to start this letter. There was a time when I thought we would make it through anything. I opened the cafe with so much hope, so many dreams. But as I sit here today, watching the door lock for what feels like the last time, I wonder if I was wrong all along. You know how I always loved watching the morning sun light up the cafe? The smell of fresh bread filling the air. Those were the moments I lived for. Now the tables are bare and the chairs sit untouched. I've been trying to hold on, but every day it's getting harder. The price of flour has doubled, and the customers who used to come in daily are staying home. They're scared. I don't blame them. I wish I could be more hopeful, but I fear we may have seen the last of this place. I don't know what comes next, Irina, but I'm trying to stay strong. It's all I can do now." Elena's story is one of loss, but also of resilience. In the midst of uncertainty, she still holds on to the hope that somehow, somewhere, the world will find a way to heal. But not everyone is as hopeful. Take Raj, a factory worker from India whose life has been turned upside down by the collapse of his industry. Raj spent over 20 years working in a textile factory. His father worked there before him, as did his grandfather. The factory, once a symbol of stability, now faces closure as global markets spiral downward and international trade agreements crumble. In a voice message sent to a friend, Raj says, "You know, I used to think my job was everything. I thought it was a safe place, a guarantee for my future, for my family. But now, every morning, I wake up to uncertainty. The factory isn't what it used to be. Orders have stopped coming in. I can see the managers and supervisors walking around with their heads down. They know. Everyone knows. I don't know what I'll do next. There are no jobs left in this town. No one is hiring. What happens to all of us, those of us who worked so hard for this? What happens when all that hard work just disappears? I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just scared. I just don't know what's next." Raj's fear is palpable in his words, but there's an underlying sense of helplessness too. His connection to the past, to the factory, and the tradition it represents is slipping away, and with it, his sense of security. But even in his despair, there's still a flicker of determination to find a way forward. Then there's Maria, a single mother in Mexico who's seen her world change dramatically in the wake of the trade war. Maria worked as a teacher, and her salary, while modest, was enough to support her young daughter. With the global trade conflict pushing the country into a severe recession, the government has slashed education budgets, leaving Maria without a job. In an email she sent to a former colleague, she writes, "Hi Rosa, I don't even know where to begin. It's hard to believe, but it feels like everything has fallen apart. I lost my job last week, and they told me there's no funding left for our school. My students, the children I've dedicated my life to teaching, they don't deserve this, but I don't know how to fix it. It's as though the world has turned its back on us. I'm trying to stay strong for my daughter, but every day is a struggle. I try to smile, to make it feel like everything is going to be okay, but deep down, I don't know what to tell her. How can I promise her a future when I can't even promise myself that? I'm scared, Rosa. Not just for me, but for all of us. How do we rebuild from this?" Maria's words cut to the heart of a central theme of this crisis, the fragility of the systems we depend on, and the devastating effects when those systems break down. Maria is a mother, a teacher, a person who has dedicated her life to shaping the future. And yet, like so many others, she now faces a future that seems uncertain, if not impossible. Lastly, there's Marcus, a young tech entrepreneur from the United States who was once on the verge of launching his startup. In the blink of an eye, his dreams were dashed when international trade restrictions halted the production of key components for his company. In a voicemail to his brother, Marcus says, "It feels like the world's just gone. We were so close. So close I could taste it. I had the investors, I had the team, I had everything lined up. And then, just like that, all the borders went up and the supply chains collapsed. The factory in China can't deliver the parts we need. No one's sending shipments anymore. It feels like the rug was pulled out from under us. But I'm not giving up. Not yet. There has to be a way. Maybe we'll find a new way to make it work. Maybe we'll pivot. Maybe we won't. But I'm not going to let this stop me. Not after everything we've been through to get here." Marcus's optimism is striking in contrast to the other stories. But there's also a quiet sense of fear in his voice. His determination to keep going, to find another path forward, reflects the resilience that still exists in many people, despite the dire circumstances. These stories are only a few of the countless individuals affected by the global trade war. Their struggles are personal, but they also reflect a larger shared reality. They are not alone in this fight. As we continue to follow their journeys, we'll see how they navigate the unknown, how they grapple with the pain of loss, and how they find new ways to adapt, survive, and perhaps even rebuild. To understand how the world arrived at this precipice, we must first look back at the series of events, decisions, and shifts that have led us to this moment. The global trade war, though seemingly sudden, was the result of decades of growing economic tensions, shifting power dynamics, and unsustainable practices that have pushed the world to the edge. At the heart of the current crisis lies a long-standing battle over trade imbalances, tariffs, and protectionist policies. While nations have been arguing over trade deals for centuries, the globalized economy that emerged in the late 20th century accelerated these tensions. In the early 2000s, nations increasingly relied on global supply chains, where products were no longer made in one country, but were assembled from parts manufactured across multiple continents. This interdependence fueled unprecedented growth, but it also created vast inequalities. In the United States, for example, manufacturing jobs moved overseas, particularly to countries like China, where labor was cheaper and regulations were more relaxed. This shift devastated communities that once relied on factory work as the backbone of their local economies. In China, this move was seen as an opportunity for economic growth and modernization. However, as China's economy boomed, it increasingly dominated global markets, creating a widening economic gap with its trading partners. The rise of Chinese power, along with other emerging economies like India and Brazil, placed immense pressure on traditional Western economic powers, particularly in terms of access to markets, control over intellectual property, and the shifting balance of power in global politics. These imbalances were increasingly seen as a direct threat to national industries and sovereignty. What started as trade agreements meant to benefit all parties gradually began to reveal the cracks in the system. The real turning point came when political leaders in several major economies began to adopt protectionist rhetoric. For years, global organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, had attempted to regulate and mediate global trade, seeking to reduce tariffs and barriers that hindered the free flow of goods. But with the rise of populism, nationalism, and a growing disillusionment with global trade deals, key leaders in the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere began to question these institutions. In 2016, the United States elected a president who promised to put America first, focusing on reducing trade deficits and rebalancing trade agreements. This rhetoric, which echoed the concerns of many working-class Americans who felt abandoned by the rapid changes in the global economy, became the rallying cry for a political shift. The Trump administration's decision to impose tariffs on imports from China, along with renegotiations of NAFTA, now replaced by the USMCA, signaled the beginning of a new era of trade wars. These actions sent shockwaves through the global economy, triggering retaliatory tariffs from China and other countries, and sparking a domino effect. Europe, too, was not immune. Countries like Italy, France, and the United Kingdom, in the wake of Brexit and rising anti-globalization sentiment, began to adopt more protectionist policies. These shifts were exacerbated by growing populist movements, where the promise of economic nationalism resonated with voters who felt left behind by globalization. The immediate fallout of these decisions was felt in both developed and developing economies. Tariffs designed to protect domestic industries ended up inflating the cost of goods. Global supply chains that had been built over decades were now disrupted, causing delays in production, shortages of raw materials, price increases for consumers. The cost of living rose sharply in many countries, particularly those heavily reliant on imports, and wages failed to keep pace with inflation. In addition to direct economic effects, the uncertainty surrounding international trade agreements created a climate of fear and instability. Companies, unsure of the future, began to scale back investment, freeze hiring, and even close operations in certain markets. The trade war became a self-fulfilling prophecy. As businesses pulled back, economies slowed, leading to a further decline in trade, further exacerbating the problem. As these effects rippled outward, financial markets began to fluctuate wildly. Stock prices, once steady in a globalized economy, became increasingly volatile. The global interconnectedness that had once been a source of stability now seemed like a curse. When one country faltered, the impact spread, first to neighboring countries and then to others caught in the web of global trade. One factor often overlooked in the current crisis is the role of technological innovation in reshaping the global landscape. Over the past 2 decades, automation, artificial intelligence, and machine learning have revolutionized manufacturing and services industries. Many companies that once outsourced production to lower-cost countries now found themselves turning to technology to cut costs. Automation allowed them to bring some of those jobs back to developed nations, but it also led to mass job displacement in both developed and developing economies. The promise of cheap labor in countries like China, India, and Vietnam had long been a key driver of global trade. But as technology advanced, many companies realized that they could produce goods with fewer workers, reducing their dependence on low-wage economies. This shift disrupted the traditional flow of goods, and the loss of cheap labor created economic strain in nations that had relied on it. This disruption, combined with tariffs and trade barriers, made it even harder for countries like China and India to continue the rapid growth they had enjoyed in the past. And as labor costs increased globally, consumers in wealthier countries found themselves facing higher prices for goods that had once been affordable. Another crucial factor that contributed to the global trade collapse was the environmental toll of endless growth. The world's insatiable demand for cheap goods came at the expense of the planet. Industrialized nations outsourced pollution to developing countries where environmental regulations were looser and where factories could produce goods without the same restrictions that applied at home. But the effects of this unchecked growth began to catch up with the world. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental disasters became more frequent and more severe. These events disrupted supply chains, damaged infrastructure, and made it increasingly difficult for nations to continue to rely on traditional methods of production. The trade war, it turns out, was just one symptom of a much deeper systemic issue. the unsustainability of the way the world had built its economy. Finally, it's important to consider the role that global institutions, such as the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, played in the lead-up to this crisis. These institutions were created after World War II with the goal of fostering international cooperation and creating a stable global economy. However, in recent years, they have struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing world. Their inability to effectively mediate conflicts, enforce trade agreements, or adapt to the challenges posed by rising nationalism and protectionism has left a vacuum that individual countries have filled with unilateral actions. When the WTO failed to resolve key trade disputes, when the IMF couldn't prevent the spiraling debt crises of some nations, and when international trade talks broke down over disagreements, the world turned inward. Countries began to see trade deals as zero-sum games rather than cooperative ventures. Instead of collaboration, we saw competition, nations fighting to secure the best deals for themselves, often at the expense of others. The collapse we are witnessing today did not happen overnight. It was the result of decades of economic imbalances, technological disruption, environmental neglect, and political shifts. What we are experiencing now is a convergence of factors that have been building for years. The collapse of global supply chains, the rise of protectionism, the failure of international institutions, and the long-term consequences of unsustainable growth. As we continue to analyze the causes of this crisis, we must also consider how we can rebuild and reimagine a global economy that is more equitable, more sustainable, and more resilient to the challenges of the future. The global trade war and the subsequent economic collapse have not spared any corner of the world. Each region connected by the intricate web of global trade has been affected differently, yet all are bound by the same overarching crisis. The collapse of one segment of the global economy ripples across continents, demonstrating the fragility and interconnectedness of our modern world. In North America, the United States, and Canada, once economic powerhouses, have seen unprecedented disruptions. In the United States, industries reliant on imported goods, such as automotive, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, have been crippled. Factories dependent on global supply chains face shortages of raw materials, forcing production halts and layoffs. American consumers, accustomed to inexpensive goods, now face skyrocketing prices for everything from groceries to electronics. The crisis has deepened political divides, with public protests erupting across the country. People are demanding government intervention, yet policies remain gridlocked, further eroding trust in institutions. Small towns that once depended on single industries like steel or agriculture are particularly hard hit. Farmers face export restrictions, and retaliatory tariffs have closed foreign markets for their products, leading to unsustainable losses. In Canada, the dependency on both U.S. trade and global markets has created a dual shock. With lumber, energy, and agricultural exports severely restricted, Canada's economy is teetering. Border towns that thrived on cross-border commerce are now ghost towns, their economies paralyzed by trade barriers. Europe, a region known for its economic integration through the European Union, is experiencing profound fragmentation. Countries that rely heavily on exports, such as Germany and France, are struggling to maintain their industries. Germany's auto industry, one of the largest in the world, has been severely impacted by the lack of imported parts and diminished global demand. Southern European countries, already grappling with high unemployment and fragile economies, have plunged deeper into crisis. Italy and Spain, heavily reliant on tourism, have seen their industries collapse as international travel dwindles due to economic instability. Greece, still recovering from its previous debt crisis, is facing an even bleaker future as investors flee. The United Kingdom, post-Brexit, has found itself in an even more precarious position. Without the support of the EU, it struggles to navigate new trade barriers and a shrinking global market. the promised benefits of leaving the Union have not materialized, leaving many disillusioned and economically vulnerable. Eastern Europe, reliant on supply chains from Western Europe and Asia, has also been destabilized. Countries like Poland and Hungary, once seen as emerging economic stars, are now struggling to adapt as their factories lose access to essential components and markets. Asia, the epicenter of global manufacturing, has seen a dramatic shift in its fortunes. China, often called the world's factory, has been particularly hard hit. The tariffs imposed by the United States and other countries have decimated its export-driven economy. Factories have closed, leading to mass layoffs and growing social unrest. The Chinese government, despite efforts to stimulate domestic consumption, has struggled to fill the void left by declining exports. India, which had positioned itself as a growing economic powerhouse, has faced its own set of challenges. The collapse of trade has disrupted its tech and textile industries, which were heavily dependent on foreign clients. Meanwhile, rising unemployment has exacerbated social and political tensions, and rural areas have been hit hardest, with millions of farmers unable to sell their crops due to disrupted supply chains. Japan and South Korea, heavily dependent on exports of technology and automobiles, are also suffering. Their close ties to the global economy have made them particularly vulnerable to the trade collapse. Despite attempts to pivot toward domestic markets, the loss of international demand has left these nations grappling with recession. Southeast Asia, with its growing economies in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, is facing an uphill battle. These nations had built their economic growth on cheap labor and exports, but with global trade disrupted, their development has stalled. Factories remain idle, and millions of workers are left without jobs. In Africa, the effects of the trade collapse are more subtle but equally devastating. Many African nations, reliant on exports of raw materials such as oil, minerals, and agricultural products, have seen their revenues plummet as global demand dries up. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa, which depend heavily on exports, are facing massive budget deficits, leading to cuts in social services and infrastructure projects. The informal economy, which supports a significant portion of the population, has also been hit. With fewer opportunities for trade, small businesses and farmers are struggling to survive. Food insecurity is on the rise, particularly in regions that depend on imported food supplies, which have become scarce and expensive. Despite the challenges, there are pockets of resilience. Communities are turning to local solutions, such as cooperative farming and small-scale manufacturing, to weather the storm. However, the lack of external support and investment has made recovery a slow and uncertain process. South America, already grappling with economic instability and political unrest, has been pushed further into crisis by the global trade collapse. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, which rely heavily on agricultural exports, have been hit hard. The global drop in demand for soybeans, coffee, and beef has left farmers in dire straits. Export revenues, once the lifeblood of these economies, have dried up, leading to sharp declines in GDP. Venezuela, already in the throes of an economic and humanitarian crisis, has seen conditions worsen. The collapse of global oil prices has further devastated its economy, leaving millions without access to basic necessities. Neighboring countries such as Colombia and Peru are struggling to absorb the influx of refugees while dealing with their own economic challenges. In the Andean regions, mining-dependent economies like Chile and Bolivia are reeling from the drop in demand for copper and other minerals. The governments of these nations are finding it increasingly difficult to maintain stability as protests over economic inequality grow. In Oceania, Australia, and New Zealand, though geographically isolated, are deeply connected to the global economy. Australia's reliance on exports of minerals and agricultural products, particularly to China, has made it vulnerable to the trade collapse. Mining towns have become ghost towns as demand for coal and iron ore has plummeted. Farmers, too, are facing significant challenges, with export markets drying up and domestic consumption unable to fill the gap. New Zealand, heavily reliant on dairy and meat exports, is experiencing a similar downturn, with tourism, another key sector, virtually non-existent due to economic instability. Both nations are facing rising unemployment and declining living standards. Efforts to pivot towards self-reliance have been met with mixed success, as the deeply ingrained dependence on global trade proves difficult to overcome. This global trade collapse has revealed just how deeply interconnected the world has become. No country exists in isolation. The struggles of one ripple outward, creating a cascade of consequences that affect even the most remote regions. The disruption of supply chains has shown how dependent nations are on each other for food, medicine, technology, and raw materials. A factory closing in China means a delay in electronic components for a company in Europe, which in turn affects the availability of products in North America. A drought in Africa leads to higher food prices worldwide, exacerbating the struggles of already vulnerable populations. The collapse of tourism in Asia and Oceania leaves millions unemployed, affecting industries from airlines to hospitality. The crisis has also highlighted the fragility of the global economy. What was once seen as a strength, interdependence, has now become a vulnerability. As nations scramble to protect their own interests, the lack of global cooperation has only deepened the crisis. Despite the widespread devastation, there are glimpses of hope and resilience. Communities are coming together to support one another, and local economies are finding ways to adapt. In some regions, the crisis has sparked innovation as people seek new ways to rebuild and reconnect in a world where global trade is no longer a given. The road ahead will be challenging, but the interconnectedness of humanity remains a source of potential strength. If nations can find a way to work together to rebuild trust and cooperation, there may still be a path toward a more equitable and sustainable future. Amid the global trade collapse, as economies shudder and uncertainty looms large, pockets of hope and resilience emerge. In every corner of the world, individuals and communities are finding ways to rebuild, adapt, and support one another. While the crisis has fractured societies, it has also unveiled the enduring strength of human ingenuity, solidarity, and compassion. This is a story of those who, in the face of adversity, have chosen to forge a path toward a new future. In Detroit, once the heart of the American automotive industry, the crisis hit hard. Years of factory closures, job losses, and economic decline had already made life difficult for its residents. But the global trade collapse drove the final nail into the coffin. Yet, rather than succumb to despair, a group of local entrepreneurs, community organizers, and citizens came together to forge a new future. Led by a woman named Sarah Lawson, a former auto worker whose family had worked in the factories for generations, a movement was born. "We've seen the worst, but we're not going down without a fight," Sarah often says to her neighbors. Sarah and a network of like-minded individuals started converting abandoned industrial spaces into community hubs where small businesses could thrive. They focused on local manufacturing, turning once derelict factories into places where people could build things again. Clothing, furniture, even renewable energy products. The Detroit Revived Initiative, as it became known, not only provided jobs, but also helped heal the psychological scars of the community. People began working together, pooling their skills and resources to create products that were locally sourced and sustainable. It wasn't about competing in the global market anymore. It was about rebuilding the community and fostering a sense of pride in local production. By the end of the year, Detroit had become a model for how cities can reclaim their economic future by embracing local sustainable practices. The economy wasn't what it used to be, but the sense of community and shared purpose was stronger than ever. In Colombia, the situation was grim. Farmers who once sold their goods to international markets now faced severe limitations on exports. Tariffs imposed by the U.S. and other nations had made it impossible to reach their primary buyers, leading to massive losses. Yet, in the rural areas of Colombia, something remarkable was happening. A coalition of farmers, led by the charismatic Juan Carlos Gutierrez, banded together to form cooperatives, where they could share resources, tools, and knowledge. If we are to survive this, we need to be strong together, Juan Carlos said in a speech to the community. They started organizing barter systems where local farmers could exchange their produce for goods and services from others. In many towns, once thriving markets that had been decimated by global disruptions began to spring back to life, not through the export of crops, but through local consumption. Local communities came together to buy, sell, and trade within their own borders. These exchanges were based on mutual respect and a belief that despite the crisis, they could take care of their own. One particularly inspiring story comes from a small village in the Andes, where the cooperative farming initiative not only revived the agricultural economy, but also introduced innovative techniques. Local farmers learned to grow a wider variety of crops, ranging from quinoa to specialty herbs, and used regenerative farming methods that rejuvenated the soil. These sustainable practices not only ensured food security for their own people, but helped rebuild the local economy in a way that was environmentally responsible. In India, where the tech sector was once a shining example of global success, the collapse of international trade left many workers without jobs. Indian software companies, heavily reliant on contracts from U.S. and European clients, were forced to shut down or pivot their business models. But among the economic rubble, a group of young innovators emerged, ready to adapt and push forward. One such group, led by Rajesh Singh, had previously worked for a major tech company, catering to international clients. When the crisis hit, Rajesh saw the opportunity to create something entirely new. "The world is changing, and so must we," he said in a meeting with his team. Rajesh and his colleagues began developing a series of low-cost, locally oriented software solutions. They focused on addressing issues that were particularly pressing within India, such as access to education, affordable healthcare, and food security. One of their most successful projects, Tech for Good, involved creating a mobile app that connected farmers directly with consumers, bypassing the disrupted supply chains. The app allowed farmers to post their goods and prices, and consumers could purchase fresh produce directly from the source. This system not only helped farmers sustain their income, but also provided affordable food for urban populations, cutting out the middlemen who had inflated prices during the crisis. Rajesh's team's shift from serving multinational corporations to focusing on local, impactful projects became a symbol of the adaptability of the Indian tech industry. Their work not only sustained jobs during the crisis, but laid the groundwork for a more self-reliant future in which technology served the needs of the people, not just profit margins. In Kenya, where the impact of the trade collapse was felt most acutely in agricultural exports, women took a leading role in finding solutions. When the global food trade stopped, many rural families, particularly women, found themselves without income. However, a group of women in the town of Nakuru decided to take matters into their own hands by focusing on education. Led by Amina Mburu, a teacher-turned-community organizer, the group began offering free educational programs to teach local women how to become self-sufficient. "It's not enough just to survive. We need to thrive," Amina would tell her students. These educational programs covered a wide range of topics, from practical skills like farming and small-scale business, management, to technical skills in digital literacy. One initiative, called Seeds of Knowledge, taught women how to use digital platforms to sell locally produced goods whether they were handcrafted items, textiles, or organic produce. This not only created new revenue streams, but also empowered women by giving them the skills to take control of their financial futures. The project became a beacon of hope for many as women began to unite, share resources, and rebuild their communities from the ground up. By learning to leverage technology, these women were able to bypass the global trade system that had left them vulnerable. They found new ways to create, exchange, and collaborate, ultimately transforming their communities into more resilient, self-sustaining entities. From the farthest reaches of the globe, stories of kindness and collaboration continue to emerge, showing us the true strength of human connection. In the midst of a broken global system, people have leaned on each other in ways that were unimaginable before, whether it's neighbors sharing food during periods of food scarcity, businesses offering free services to those in need, or individuals coming together to rebuild shattered communities. Acts of kindness are proving to be the glue that holds society together. In small towns across Europe, for instance, local organizations have opened their doors to provide housing and food to displaced workers, often without government support. In the Middle East, where supply chains have collapsed, there have been widespread efforts by ordinary citizens to share resources and keep basic services running. In these places, resilience is not a solitary effort. It is a collective one, rooted in the belief that together we are stronger. The global crisis may have fractured economies, but it has not broken the human spirit. Across the world, people are coming together to build new systems of support, local resilience, and sustainability. Through community initiatives, innovation, and acts of kindness, individuals are proving that even in the darkest times, hope is not only possible, it is a driving force for change. While the road ahead is long, these stories of resilience offer a powerful reminder that, in times of crisis, the bonds we share with one another are the true foundation upon which we can rebuild the world. The global trade collapse has revealed the raw edges of human society, where despair thrives on the ruins of lost prosperity and hope blooms amidst the cracks. It is in this delicate balance between the darkness of human suffering and the light of human resilience that the true nature of this crisis can be understood. While some regions face economic and social devastation, others find themselves innovating, adapting, and pulling together in ways previously unimaginable. This is the duality of the human condition in a time of crisis, a contrast of the darkest moments of despair with the brightest sparks of hope. In many parts of the global south, the impacts of the trade collapse have been harsh and unforgiving. Countries with economies built on raw materials and exports have found themselves at the mercy of foreign trade barriers. For some, the collapse of global markets has meant the end of a way of life. Take the story of Eduardo Hernandez, a small-scale farmer in El Salvador. Eduardo's family has been farming coffee for generations, selling their beans to European markets. But when the tariffs hit, his coffee, once in high demand, was left unsold. The cost of production, already high due to unstable local conditions, soared as transportation costs rose and supply chains broke down. Soon, Eduardo found himself facing ruin. I used to wake up every day with the hope that my coffee would go to someone who would appreciate it, he says in a letter to a friend. Now, there's no one to buy it, no one to pay for the work of my hands. His despair reflects the plight of countless farmers in regions dependent on global trade, who are now left with nothing but dwindling supplies and rising debts. Eduardo's story is not an isolated one. In rural regions across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, farmers face similar fates. With demand for agricultural exports slashed, the livelihoods of millions are being erased in the wake of the trade war. Even as governments scramble to negotiate new deals, the damage is deep and the wounds are slow to heal. As Eduardo walks through his barren fields, he wonders if he will ever see his crops thrive again. For many, the global collapse has triggered a cycle of despair. where daily survival becomes the only focus. Without the global markets they once relied on, many have turned inward, struggling to sustain even the most basic level of economic activity. And without external support, it seems that the suffering of the global south is being ignored by the world stage. In developed nations, too, the effects of the trade collapse are evident. In the United States, the working class has been hit hard. Once bustling factory towns where people worked in the automotive, steel, or tech sectors are now hollowed out communities. The promise of prosperity through globalization has crumbled, and the working class finds itself abandoned. Take John Matthews, a factory worker from Pennsylvania. John worked in an automotive plant for over 20 years, assembling parts for cars that would be shipped worldwide. But when trade tariffs crippled the market for American-made vehicles, his factory was forced to shut down, leaving hundreds like him unemployed. "Everything I worked for is gone," John says, his voice thick with frustration. "The car I built, the paycheck I got, it doesn't mean anything now. I don't even know where I'll be living next month." John's experience is shared by millions. In the Midwest, once home to the iconic steel mills and automobile factories, the loss of trade markets has led to widespread joblessness, leading to increased homelessness and mental health crises. Communities built on industrial pride now face a future of disillusionment and poverty. The hope that was once fostered by work and industry has turned to bitterness as people struggle to hold on to what little they have left. In stark contrast to these narratives of despair, there are glimmers of hope and resilience that refuse to be extinguished. In Detroit, once the heart of the American automotive industry, people have chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. Amid the closures and the economic fallout, a community of determined entrepreneurs and activists has chosen to innovate and create anew. Sarah Lawson, a former auto worker who witnessed the decline of the industry firsthand, has become one of the most visible figures in this movement. "We're not going to wait for someone to save us," Sarah says, her words carrying the weight of experience and determination. "We are going to build our future ourselves." In Detroit, a city ravaged by the collapse of the global auto industry, people have turned abandoned factories into hubs of innovation. Instead of manufacturing vehicles, these once dominant spaces are now home to small-scale local manufacturers producing everything from solar panels to furniture. The Detroit Revived initiative has spurred a renaissance in local industry, fueled by a belief that resilience comes not from surviving the storm, but from using it to build something new. "We don't have to be the world's factory anymore," Sarah explains. "We just need to make sure we're building for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our children." In the face of immense adversity, the people of Detroit are proving that while global systems may fail, local communities can still thrive through innovation, solidarity, and self-reliance. In Colombia, another story of hope emerges from the rubble of a broken trade system. Eduardo Hernandez, the farmer whose coffee crops were destroyed by the collapse, joined forces with other small farmers in his region to create a cooperative. Though his initial instinct was to give up and abandon his farm, he realized that he wasn't alone in his struggle. The cooperative, Cosecha de Esperanza, Harvest of Hope, was born out of a shared understanding that survival depended on mutual aid. The farmers pooled their resources, shared equipment, and began focusing on sustainable local markets. Rather than relying on distant international buyers, they turned inward, focusing on supplying their community and neighboring towns. They even began to diversify their crops, focusing on growing organic produce that was in high demand locally. Slowly, the cooperative began to rebuild their livelihoods. "We're not just surviving," Eduardo says, "we're thriving together." This transformation is happening across many rural communities in Colombia. As local economies are restructured to focus on self-sufficiency, Many farmers are finding that they can create sustainable businesses without relying on international trade. Their resilience is rooted not just in economic recovery, but in the recognition that the crisis has forced them to return to the basics: community, cooperation, and sustainability. In India, where the collapse of the global tech market left thousands of workers unemployed, the response has been one of remarkable innovation. Rajesh Singh, an ex-software engineer, is one of the many young entrepreneurs who turned their attention to the local economy after global clients canceled contracts. Instead of watching his community flounder in despair, Rajesh focused on creating tech solutions for India's local challenges. His startup, Tech for Good, created affordable software solutions for rural farmers, helping them bypass trade barriers by directly connecting with consumers via mobile apps. Rajesh's work embodies the duality of the crisis. On one hand, he faces the uncertainty of a broken global economy. On the other, he is part of a growing movement of tech innovators who are developing solutions that do not rely on international trade. The crisis has forced us to rethink what is important. Rajesh says, "It's not about catering to foreign markets anymore. It's about solving the problems of our own people." By focusing on local needs, Rajesh and his peers have not only created jobs in the tech sector, but have sparked a larger movement of self-sufficiency and innovation that will outlast the global crisis. Their work exemplifies how crisis can be the catalyst for reinvention. The global trade collapse has revealed both the worst and best of human nature. For some, the crisis has led to despair, an overwhelming sense of loss, and abandonment as the world they knew collapses around them. For others, the crisis has sparked innovation, cooperation, and resilience as communities rise from the ashes to build something new. What is clear is that in times of crisis, humanity shows its duality, the capacity for both despair and hope, for destruction and creation, for selfishness and solidarity. The stories of those who have chosen to rebuild and adapt demonstrate the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. In this world where systems and economies can fail, it is the strength of communities, the determination of individuals, and the shared belief in a better future that will ultimately determine how we navigate the crisis. And while we may be walking through dark times, it is the light of human resilience that will guide us toward a new tomorrow. The global trade collapse has not only reshaped the world's economies, but has also left an indelible psychological and societal mark on individuals and communities. The far-reaching consequences of this crisis are not just seen in the loss of jobs, industries, and infrastructure, but in the mental and emotional toll it has taken on people worldwide. The breakdown of economic systems and the fragmentation of societies have created an environment of uncertainty, fear, and despair. At the same time, these challenges have highlighted a growing disillusionment with established institutions and systems, with many losing faith in the very structures that once provided stability. This is the hidden toll of the crisis, the psychological strain that weighs heavily on the human psyche, and the societal shifts that fracture the trust in institutions that once seemed unshakable. It is a story of people struggling to adapt to new realities, grappling with a sense of loss, and confronting the question of what comes next in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable. The collapse of global trade has left millions of individuals struggling with a profound sense of anxiety and helplessness. In countries that were once thriving through their involvement in international markets, people now face uncertainty about their future. In many cases, the economic losses have translated into a crisis of identity and purpose. For individuals like Maria Gonzalez, a former employee at an electronics manufacturing plant in Mexico, the emotional impact of the crisis has been devastating. "I don't know who I am anymore," Maria admits. "I spent my whole life working at that plant, believing that if I did my job well, I could support my family and have a better future, but now everything has fallen apart. My family doesn't have enough food, and I don't know how to find a new job. Maria's experience is not unique. The loss of long-standing jobs and the inability to find new work have contributed to a growing wave of anxiety and depression across the globe. As unemployment rises and financial instability becomes a constant companion, people are grappling with feelings of worthlessness, isolation, and fear. The loss of social mobility, the idea that one can work hard, progress, and improve their situation, has been replaced by a grim uncertainty about the future. In developed nations, this crisis has exacerbated pre-existing mental health issues. Research indicates that the global trade collapse has led to an increase in cases of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. People who once felt secure in their livelihoods now face an unprecedented challenge to rebuild their lives in the face of an economic system that seems to have failed them. The psychological burden of the crisis is felt particularly by the working class, who have seen their sense of security evaporate. One of the most profound societal effects of the trade collapse is the erosion of trust in institutions. For decades, global trade and economic systems were seen as the foundation of modern society. These systems promised prosperity, stability, and progress, at least for those who could adapt to them. However, as these institutions falter, and as the promises they made remain unfulfilled, the social contracts that binds people to governments, corporations, and other authorities is being questioned. In many parts of the world, this loss of trust has been especially acute. In the United States, the collapse of trade relations and the subsequent job losses led to a growing sentiment of disillusionment with the government. Citizens who once believed in the American dream now feel betrayed as they watch their communities crumble and the promises of globalization unravel. The failure of governments to prevent or address the crisis has led to an increasing number of people questioning the efficacy of their elected leaders. How could they let this happen? How could they let us all fall so far? Says John Matthews, a former factory worker in Ohio, who lost his job when tariffs and trade restrictions crippled his industry. We trusted these people to take care of us, but instead, they turned their backs on us. I don't know who to trust anymore. This loss of faith in government institutions is mirrored in the corporate world as well. For decades, multinational corporations were seen as engines of growth and prosperity. But when these corporations shifted their focus away from local communities to maximize profits through global trade, many people felt betrayed. The abandonment of local workers, the offshoring of jobs, and the exploitation of labor in developing nations have all contributed to a deepening mistrust of the corporate world. Across the globe, there has been a growing sense of alienation as people feel disconnected from the institutions that were once designed to protect them. In many cases, the social fabric is unraveling as people turn away from traditional sources of authority and look for alternatives. The breakdown of trust in institutions is creating a fragmented society where individuals no longer feel united by a common set of values or goals. As trust in established institutions continues to erode, many people have turned to alternative ideologies and movements, some of which offer simplistic solutions to complex problems. The rise of populism, both on the left and the right, has been one of the most significant political responses to the crisis. Populist leaders capitalize on the feelings of anger, fear, and hopelessness, often using rhetoric that scapegoats marginalized groups or blames foreign entities for national problems. In countries like Italy, the United States, and Brazil, populist movements have surged as a reaction to the perceived failures of traditional political systems. Leaders who promise to restore the nation to its former glory, or take back control from foreign influence, attract followers who feel betrayed by globalization and disenfranchised by the political establishment. While populism provides an outlet for frustration, it also risks deepening societal divisions. In many cases, these movements exploit existing fears and prejudices, pitting different social, ethnic, or economic groups against one another. The polarization of society only intensifies as people look for scapegoats rather than solutions. This social fragmentation threatens to further destabilize already fragile communities. Despite the overwhelming sense of despair, many individuals and communities are finding ways to cope with the psychological strain and rebuild their trust in one another. As global systems crumble, people are relying more heavily on their local communities, seeking solidarity and support from those closest to them. In areas affected by economic collapse, grassroots movements are emerging to fill the gaps left by governments and corporations. These movements are grounded in mutual aid, collective action, and the idea that survival and recovery depend on people working together. Local cooperatives, community-led initiatives, and volunteer networks are helping to restore a sense of connection and purpose. For individuals like Amina Mburu, a community leader in Kenya, the key to resilience lies in focusing on small, actionable steps rather than grand, unattainable solutions. We can't fix everything overnight, Amina says, but if we help one person today and one more tomorrow, we can rebuild. We can create a world where we don't just survive, but thrive together. Similarly, in Colombia, communities are embracing restorative practices, coming together to rebuild both their local economies and their sense of shared identity. Rather than waiting for government intervention, these communities are pooling resources, offering skills training, and building networks of support. As they rebuild, they are learning that resilience doesn't just come from external sources, but from within, through collective action, solidarity, and an unwavering belief in the power of the human spirit. The psychological and societal effects of the global trade collapse are profound and far-reaching. The crisis has left many individuals struggling to come to terms with a new reality, marked by insecurity, fear, and a sense of loss. The breakdown of trust in institutions, whether governmental or corporate, has deepened societal divisions and created fertile ground for populist movements that promise easy answers to complex problems. However, in the face of adversity, there are also signs of hope. Communities are coming together, rediscovering the importance of solidarity, mutual aid, and local resilience. In this period of societal upheaval, people are finding new ways to cope, rebuild, and reconnect with one another. While the road ahead is uncertain, the resilience and strength of individuals and communities offer a glimmer of hope that, despite the psychological and societal toll, humanity can adapt, evolve, and rebuild even in the most challenging times. As we come to the end of this journey, reflecting on the global trade collapse and its far-reaching consequences, one truth becomes evident. Humanity has faced crises before, and each time we have found a way to rise again. This moment in history, as challenging and uncertain as it feels, is no different. It is not the first time that systems have failed us, and it will not be the last. But what defines us is not the crises themselves. It is how we respond to them. Throughout this narrative, we've seen how the collapse of global trade has affected individuals, communities, and entire nations. We've heard stories of despair, but also of hope. Stories of people coming together to forge new paths, to rebuild what was lost, and to reimagine what is possible. These stories remind us that while no single person can solve a crisis of this magnitude, collective action and solidarity can make the seemingly impossible possible. Resilience is not just about surviving hardship. It is about adapting, learning, and growing in the face of adversity. The communities in Detroit, Colombia, and Kenya have shown us that even when global systems fail, the strength of local networks and the human spirit can create new opportunities. These acts of courage and determination are proof that our greatest resource is each other. Now, more than ever, it is clear that we cannot face this challenge alone. Whether in times of crisis or calm, humanity thrives when we act as one, when we look beyond our differences and come together to solve common problems. The trade collapse has highlighted how interconnected we are. It has also revealed the vulnerabilities of relying on systems that prioritize profits over people, competition over collaboration. This is our opportunity to rebuild, not just physically or economically, but morally and socially. It is a chance to create a world where the values of community, equity, and sustainability guide our actions. But this can only happen if we all play our part. Every small action counts, whether it's supporting local businesses, volunteering to help those in need, or simply being there for a neighbor. The collective impact of these actions can be transformative. Together, we can form a chain of kindness and resilience that ripples outwards, touching lives and inspiring others to do the same. In times of crisis, it's easy to feel isolated, to believe that your struggles are yours alone. But the stories we've shared today demonstrate that we are not alone. Across the world, people are grappling with similar challenges, and many are finding ways to turn their struggles into strength. This shared experience is what unites us. If you're listening to this broadcast, know that your voice matters. Your actions, no matter how small, contribute to the larger story we are all part of. Support your community. Reach out to those who may be struggling. Share your own story, because your experience can inspire someone else to keep going. Let this moment be a reminder that, even in the darkest times, humanity's capacity for compassion, innovation, and resilience shines through. When we lift each other up, we create a foundation strong enough to withstand any storm. Rebuilding isn't just about restoring what was lost. It's about reimagining what can be. As we move forward, we must ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to build? This is a chance to prioritize sustainability over short-term gains, to invest in local economies, and to ensure that progress benefits everyone, not just a select few. It will take effort, time, and perseverance, but the potential for a better world is within our reach. The communities we've discussed today offer a blueprint for this new reality. They show us that rebuilding is not just a task for governments or corporations. It's something we all can and must contribute to. If we commit to working together, to listening to one another, and to building systems that are more just and equitable, we can create a future where crises like this one are less devastating, where humanity is better prepared to weather the storms ahead. As we close, I want to leave you with a challenge. How will you contribute to this story? What steps will you take to support your community, to build resilience, and to create hope where it's needed most? You can start small by helping a neighbor, supporting local businesses, or donating to a cause that matters to you. Share what you've learned today with others and encourage them to join in the effort to rebuild. Every action matters, no matter how small it may seem. And if this message has resonated with you, there's one more thing you can do right now. Engage with this broadcast. Share it with your friends and family. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts or sharing your own experiences. Subscribe to our channel to stay connected as we continue to tell the stories of resilience and hope from around the world. Your participation is crucial in spreading this message and building a network of support that spans borders and cultures. The global trade collapse has shaken the foundations of our world, but it has also revealed the strength and potential within each of us. This is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a new chapter, one where humanity comes together to rebuild, to innovate, and to create a future defined not by despair, but by hope. As you go about your day, remember this: you are not alone. We are all part of this story, and together we can write the next chapter. Let's make it one of unity, resilience, and progress. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this journey.